Initially, or originally, maybe I should say, I was interested in using horseshoe crabs as a what we call a modern analog. So animals that are alive today that we can compare to things that are no longer alive to sort of understand these fossil animals.
500 million years ago, further in the past than you or I can even comprehend in our minds, an explosion of life began on planet Earth.
During a time period called the Cambrian. The Cambrian is about 500 million years ago, so 500 million years. And it's a time period in which we see the very rapid diversification of marine ecosystems that we can kind of see today.
Known as the Cambrian explosion, this stretch of geologic time marked a decided uptick in the sheer diversity and complexity of our planet's life. Every animal alive today can trace its lineage in one way or another to an ancient ancestor alive during this near primordial period in deep time. Now, if we fast forward another 50 or so million years, really just a blink in geologic time, we find ourselves where, or should I say when, today's story truly begins. It is here, in the time period known as the Ordovician, that the Earth saw its first animal known as a horseshoe crab. And if you take one of these fossils of these ancient animals and put it right next to a living horseshoe crab and spot the difference?
Those Jurassic horseshoe crabs that we find in southern Europe, in the quarry in southern Europe, look almost identical.
You find an animal that has seemingly changed so little from the time it was alive in ancient seas that most people have given it a rather mysterious moniker.
You know, we often call horseshoe crabs living fossils, and we call them that because they haven't changed very much externally.
Indeed, all it takes is one look at this armored alien arthropod to think that it crawled straight from the dirt where fossils are found.
But when we say that they're living fossils, it doesn't mean they're not evolving.
But is there more to this story? How is it that an animal that has seemingly changed so little could survive on an Earth governed by that ultimate evolutionary rule, that in the face of a world changing drastically around them, one must adapt or perish?
Honestly, 5 mass extinctions. They've seen the world very literally be hammered by meteorite. They've seen the world be very literally turned upside down by supervolcanoes. They've seen the world basically freeze over, and they survived all of this. I think that's a really beautiful summary of just general survivorship in that, over that deep time context.
These events that the horseshoe crabs have lived through are called mass extinctions for a reason. Even the power, cunning, and ferocity of the dinosaurs couldn't survive in the face of a cataclysm that humbled the very concept of life itself. So why? What is it about the horseshoe crab that allowed them to succeed where the literal dinosaurs failed? And how does their life history strategy today help ensure that they'll be around for millions of years to come?
And so they get themselves out of their little balloons and come charging up to the surface. If there's a whole nest of them hatching at the same time.
The more you dig in, the more fascinating the secrets lying beneath their shells truly become.
There's like a little volcano of trilobite larvae coming up out of the sand.
Understanding these secrets, both from now and from deep time, may be more important than ever, because now we find ourselves on the precipice of an Earth that is changing more rapidly than ever before. And if these animals are to be around for another 450 million years...
They're being impacted by humans. They're being influenced by factors that are not... Well, they're extrinsic, or they're beyond the horseshoe crab individual, but they are ultimately human in origin.
Well, they just might need our help. Let's descend. Hey there! You're listening to Bio-Diversity, the podcast about pelagic paradigms and coral curiosities, each episode bringing the best and flippin' fun fish facts straight to your earholes. It's like we're the delivery drivers of peer-reviewed aquatic science, the Grubhub of fish food for your mind, the DoorDash of dope decapods. If you're new around here on the show we examine the weird, wacky, and wonderful diversity of life that lives under the sparkling waters of our blue planet. Using science as our guide, we dive deep into both the common and the rare, the exotic and the ugly. So tune in for the tuna, and hang around for the lithified limulus. Let's descend. Today on the show, we are continuing the story of the enigmatic horseshoe crab. We're going to take a look backwards through deep time and examine a bit of the fossil record with Dr. Russell Bicknell, and after that we're going to take a look into the present and a little bit towards the future, as we examine the wondrous life history of these animals with Dr. Jane Brockmann. What can we learn from millions of years of history? How these animals cope with the present? And how can studying and understanding this entire life story help us protect them from a threat of our own making? The brilliant past and future story of these animals is episode 2 of our 3-part series on horseshoe crabs. If you haven't listened to episode 1 yet, where we cover the amazing biology and ecology of these creatures, you can do so for free on your favorite podcast app. Learn about their life-saving blood, why they aren't really crabs, and how they see by melting their own eyeballs. It's a fun time, I promise. In that episode, we also introduced our 3 guests.
My name is Mark Botton. I am a professor emeritus of biology at Fordham University in New York City.
I'm Jane Brockmann, and I am a emeritus professor from the Department of Biology at the University of Florida.
Yeah, hi. So my name is Russell Bicknell, and I am currently based in Adelaide, Australia. So I am a governmentally funded research person based down under.
In this episode, we begin with our hands in the dirt, doing the paleontological work that 5-year-old me always thought that I was destined for. But as we excavate the earth, we realize it's not just dirt and rocks we're digging through here. In reality, we're sifting through the sediment of ancient seas, looking for biological treasure. The centerpiece of many museum exhibits and key to understanding a more primordial Earth, we are looking for fossils. But starting with the basics here, what exactly do we mean when we say the word fossil?
Now that is a good question. A fossil is anything that was once alive that is now locked into the rock record. It has passed through a process called lithification, or literally being turned to rock.
Now, hopefully, at some point in your life, you've laid eyes upon a fossil, be that a fossilized dinosaur bone, a fern, or a fish, so you might have some idea in your head of what it is that Dr. Bicknell studies. And there really is something magical about laying eyes on a physical record of an animal or plant that existed in an entirely different time. These fossils, these incredible connections to Earth's history, form in a lot of different ways. But the basics are that fossils form when an animal, plant, or other form of life dies and gets rapidly buried by a sediment, like mud, sand, or ash. Which, as you may or might not expect, happens more frequently in a dynamic environment like the ocean. The organism becomes trapped under the sediment, and over millions of years, processes like groundwater movement carry minerals up to fill either the cellular spaces of the trapped body, common for animals with bones, or the empty space that body left behind after it fully decomposes. Those minerals then harden or crystallize, quite literally turning the animal, or the space it left behind, into rock. And that's just the basics. Honestly, the more you learn about fossil formation, the more fascinating it becomes.
Fossils can also include evidence of an animal or an organism moving. is what we call trace fossils. So examples of these are things like dinosaur footprints. But in my realm, we have examples such as horseshoe crab footprints and those kinds of things. So, yeah, a fossil is a very complicated object. At the end of the day, basically anything that was alive on Earth can possibly go through a process of becoming a fossil.
This can, of course, lead to some fascinating clues about life as it existed in a primordial time, but it can also lead to some occasionally pretty hilarious moments locked in the fossil record.
Russell was up here in the States for a postdoc, and so I got to do some stuff with him while he was at the American Museum. Russell had this really cool fossil specimen of a horseshoe crab that he was nice enough to share with me, and it was interesting because it was actually caught in the act of pooping. It's like a moment frozen in time that, a moment earlier or later it wouldn't have. Actually, as I'm sure he told you, there's actually surprisingly few fossilized horseshoe crabs. The specimens themselves, there just aren't that many of them. So to find one like that was interesting.
It is because fossils exist that we know anything about life on Earth before us silly humans entered the picture. What these animals were, what they ate, how they lived, traveled, and, well, pooped. We even have a special name for fossilized poop, fun fact, coprolite. All of these fossils, poop, footprints, and animals turned to rock, are incredibly valuable. I mean, economically, to some collectors and museums for sure, but also for the amazing stories that they can tell us that we cannot get from literally anywhere else.
Ah, gosh. Writing a grant application. Why should we care about fossils? Especially when we can fund cancer. So that's a really good question. The thing the fossil record gives us is it gives us time. Now, humans, we don't really think about time in the way that geologists or paleontologists do. Time for us, like a year is like a long period of time. A decade's a very long period of time. A century is multiple generations of human beings, right? The paleontological record, the geological record, gives us a scale of millions to tens of millions to hundreds of millions. Numbers that objectively I actually can't conceptualize because my life is so short. Our lives, humanity's existence is so short. When we think of I think of the pyramids, like 300, it's 3,000 years ago. That feels like a really long time ago. In the grand scheme of things, it's not. And so looking at fossils that are so old allow us to do is to actually understand how organisms have changed.
Each fossil we find and study, just like the next jigsaw piece that you would place in a puzzle, reveals a small bit more about this overall story of change. And we can place each puzzle piece in its proper place because we can date the fossils. Well, not with wining and dining, of course, but through measuring of isotopes of certain elements, piecing together clues from the surrounding rocks and other fossils, even looking at remnants of how these rocks reacted to how Earth's magnetic field was at the time, we can actually piece together a decent idea about how long ago these fossils, these actual animals, existed in our lands, oceans, skies, and shores. And horseshoe crabs, they are one of the oldest groups of animals that are still alive today.
So I published a paper about 3 weeks ago that documented one of the oldest horseshoe crabs. So that is from the Ordovician, just about 460 million years ago, maybe a little bit 480, somewhere in that space, from Saudi Arabia. But we actually have older horseshoe crabs. There are horseshoe crabs from the lower Ordovician of Morocco, and actually in central United States. And there are even older ones that are from, I believe, Utah. So those are really getting down to that 500 million years of age. They've been around for a really, really, really long period of time.
To put that in some context, that predates some of our earliest evidence of sharks, which is another one of Earth's most successful animal groups. Horseshoe crabs long predate dinosaurs, trees, and flowers. They're older than Saturn's rings, the Rocky Mountains, or even the Atlantic Ocean as we know it. So put it all together, and these passionate paleontologists can construct a timeline of species in the fossil record, and really, with their own eyes, bear witness to evolution taking place through the annals of deep time. And when you combine that with the science from other geologists and other paleontologists, we can learn even more. If we compare these natural history timelines with what we know about the timeline of Earth itself, we can arrive at a better understanding of how these animals have dealt with, adapted to, and survived periods of extreme change. How did they deal with water that had no oxygen? What did they do to survive the ice ages? What evolutionary pressure caused it to be shaped like a friend? It's through this kind of historical investigation and putting together the puzzle pieces that we arrive at things like the dinosaurs being common knowledge, captivating hearts and minds with the endless wonder and possibility that life on Earth holds. Not only that, but these studies also often hold great nuggets of information that can help us understand and adapt to our own changing future. Climate change being one contemporary example, but it can also help us better understand the history of these animals so that we might better protect them.
Well, that being said, today, horseshoe crabs are, what's happening with their populations gives us a really good idea of how humans are impacting them. And so, if you're seeing a decreased range abundance of horseshoe crabs, it's probably going to be telling you that there's some kind of habitat modification that's been happening that is negatively impacting these organisms.
So at this point, I hope I've convinced you about the power of paleontology. But back to the topic at hand. What can we learn specifically from the horseshoe crab fossil record? When you take a look at the precious few horseshoe crab fossils that we've found, one of the most immediately striking things is how similar those ancient animals, millions of years old, are to the 4 species that still roam the Earth today. Sure, there may be a spike slightly to the left or a slightly different telson shape, but overall, these animals look as if they've coasted through deep time almost entirely untouched by the hands of evolution. There are other examples of this phenomenon too, where living animals today seemingly have stopped evolving, at least on the surface. Ginkgo trees, coelacanths, certain soft sea urchins, some wasps and beetles, all of these look remarkably similar to their modern-day counterparts. This phenomenon is so unique that your biology textbook's favorite father figure, Darwin, even coined a new term for them, that of the living fossil. So, of course, that begs the question, is the lesson that we learn here just that these animals happened to find what worked ages ago, stuck with it, and got lucky time and time again?
That's a good question. So when Darwin posed the idea of a living fossil, the concept was an organism that does not change. Now, objectively, we know this not to be the case for horseshoe crabs because they've gone through periods in which they have changed markedly, in which we've seen radiations and extinctions associated with changes at the global scale.
So if you're like Dr. Bicknell and turn a critical eye to the fair number of different horseshoe crab species we've observed in the fossil record, it turns out that the story that all modern-day animals are near equal to all ancient ones actually falls short of the truth by quite a large margin.
Now, in the context of our horseshoe crabs, what the really beautiful thing that we can demonstrate is that their overall body, the overall morphology, their overall shape, it has gone through interesting periods of change. You get weird diversifications of these crazy weird shapes. They moved into different kinds of environments, into more sort of maybe a little bit freshwater, maybe a little lacustrine, but then they've always returned back to these marine conditions. But at its origin, deep, deep, deep in the fossil record, horseshoe crabs look pretty similar to what they do today.
So when you see an ancient animal from deep time looking nearly identical to one that is alive today, it can be pretty easy to mentally fill in the story in between. But that misses out on the weird, wacky, and wonderful diversity that radiated out between then and now.
I think a lot of the conversations around the idea that they're living fossils kind of has this origin in the reality that our fossil forms look very similar to our modern animals.
But again, if you look at this with a critical eye, you see that even modern horseshoe crabs aren't a perfect one-to-one with their ancient counterparts.
But then if we take a moment to look at how other things have changed, like size, for example, our modern day horseshoe crabs are much, much larger than they are in the fossil record. So even if they overall look similar, there are other aspects of the biology, of the physiology, that are still leaning towards the reality that they are still evolving, they are still changing, they are still adapting, except they reach effectively a peak, an adaptive peak in terms of morphology, where they don't need to move away from it because, okay, yeah, this system works. Look like a horseshoe crab, cool. Like, I don't need to change too much. But getting bigger is still an illustration of change. It's still an illustration of evolution, of adaptation, marching forward through time.
So when you ask that question, whether or not they are true living fossils, the answer boils down to what is really becoming one of my favorite explanations on this show. Kind of yes, but actually no.
So I think that's kind of my perspective, that there are multiple lines of evidence that ultimately indicate that they are not, in the strictest or a more relaxed definition, living fossils, and that they have a very complex evolutionary history that maybe is a little bit overshadowed when we kind of lump them into the group of living fossils.
Now, living fossil is a great title to inspire the imagination and draw engagement, which a creature like this will really benefit from. But, as Dr. Bicknell states, this also does kind of cover up some additional exciting truths about these animals. And when we pay attention to these truths, and don't just put these animals on a shelf thinking we know all there is to know already, we do find that these animals have a lot to teach us. Not just about themselves, but even about ancient Earth itself.
So, in paleontology, there's a sort of philosophy of, do the fossils indicate environment, or do the rocks indicate an environment in which the fossils or the organisms were found? And so it's sort of like this duality of understanding organisms in deep time. The presence of horseshoe crabs we're more and more seeing doesn't necessarily dictate certain environmental conditions. If I were looking at like a sand dune-like environment, and I saw what I thought was a sand dune-like environment, and I saw a horseshoe crab fossil, I'd probably be like, okay, my interpretation is very wrong. Or I can use this to infer that I might not have reconstructed my geology correctly. But there is sort of this complex interplay of rocks and the fossils. And so it's important to understand kind of both of them in conjunction with each other.
When you take this kind of approach, the amount of environmental inferences you can make from a single fossil might be a little bit higher than you might initially think. Maybe not just about physical conditions of the Earth at that time, but biological ones too. How did other ancient species interact with the one that you have a fossil of? Take, for instance, one particularly intriguing study from Bicknell et al. On an ancient species, Euprops danae.
Yeah, so Euprops is a fairly well-known fossil horseshoe crab from a time period called the Carboniferous. The Carboniferous is named so from all the coal, carbon that we get from these kinds of rocks. And Euprops is really interesting because it is one of these extreme forms that it describes. It has lots of sort of elongated spines, and it just kind of looks like a little bit funky. Like if you took a modern day horseshoe crab and you kind of stretched it out in Adobe Photoshop, that's sort of what you would get. And the thing that we found really interesting about this particular specimen was it's a large individual. These animals don't generally get more than sort of maybe 2 to 2.5 inches long. This one was really quite large. And I thought it was kind of funky. But then the really interesting thing was this individual has these sort of like dimpled structures, these sort of impressions in the exoskeleton, which I'd never seen before. And I spent quite a lot of time looking at horseshoe crabs in museums. So this really sort of jumped out at me as being just kind of funky. And so I reached out to my colleague, Jason Dunlop in Germany. I said, hey, Jason, like, have you, he's done a lot of work on chelicerates. I said, have you seen this before? And he said, I haven't, but it reminds me of algal infections that we see today in modern horseshoe crabs. And I was like, that is really, really cool, because what that is telling us is that these kinds of interactions that we see today have a very, very, very deep fossil record. That 310 million years ago, our horseshoe crabs were effectively being infected by algae. And what's really cool about this is it also gives us an idea of the maximum size of horseshoe crabs. So horseshoe crabs, they have what we call a terminal molt. So they get bigger and they get bigger and they get bigger. And then when they hit sexual maturity, they stop molting. And they stop molting basically because at this point, well, we've hit a point of, well, I can reproduce now. I'm an adult. I don't need to continue to cast off my exoskeleton. Let's contrast things like lobsters that consistently molt and continue to grow. Now, when horseshoe crabs hit their terminal molt, what happens is their exoskeleton kind of behaves like a moving micro ecosystem, and stuff starts to like grow on them. So they'll get seaweed and they'll get shells and they'll get a bunch of different organisms that effectively infest themselves upon the exoskeleton. So molting basically is the way that they kind of deal with this. And basically they shit up their exoskeletons, and their exoskeleton, they grow a new one and it's all clean and fresh, and they're like, cool, sweet, I don't have to deal with this. But when they hit that terminal molt, they are impacted by this. So fouling organisms can decrease mobility, they can decrease range of motion, they can result in additional infestation, which can actually be detrimental to the overall biology and survival of the individual. So they kind of have this defense mechanism, but the defense mechanism stops at a point, which is a little bit unfortunate. And because they don't shed their exoskeleton anymore, they can't get rid of, they can't foul off these organisms. And seeing this in the fossil record, this infestation, that tells us this organism really had got to that final molting stage. This is an indication of sort of what sexual maturity of horseshoe crabs in the fossil record looks like in terms of size, and it tells us a little bit about these kind of interactions that we see more commonly today. And so like one specimen has a whole big story associated with it.
That story, that connection between the past and future here is so fascinating, because learning about these animals and things like the diseases that afflicted them in deep time yields a wealth of information, both about past animals and current ones. A theoretical example of a use of this. When we piece together the story of euprops, alongside what we know about the climactic conditions, the water quality, the nutrient conditions it faced, we can start looking for similar situations that might be in our own present or future. In the broadest sense, comparing ancient history to modern cases could help us predict, model, and prepare for a future when these conditions might be repeated and impact our modern species' success rate. And that's super important, because conserving these animals has a lot of value. Both inherently as members of the animal kingdom, of course, but economically too. Our previous episode discussed how these animals are used in both the fishing and biomedical industries, and how important they still are for protecting human lives. So the last thing we want is to put them in conditions where infestation or disease could interfere with their future success. In short, knowledge from the past is valuable for a secure future.
And this is where kind of like my conservation mindset overlaps with the fossil record aspect, because today these are animals that are becoming more and more endangered. They're being impacted by humans. They're being influenced by factors that are not, well, they're extrinsic, or they're beyond the horseshoe crab individual, but they are ultimately human in origin. And there needs to really be a call to arms in terms of conservation efforts for these organisms.
Now, knowing their past stories is an important part of securing a future for these animals, but it is equally as important that we understand them as they are, now, in the modern day. And for horseshoe crabs, a secure future means successful reproduction. You can't keep living on this earth if you don't keep your lineage going, generation after generation. Immortal jellyfish, these animals are not. From that conservation standpoint, understanding the birds and the bees of these critters means we might be better equipped to help ensure that they have the right habitats and conditions to keep procreating long into the future. So, consider this your young ears warning, as the next part of the episode goes a little bit deeper into the biological details of how this happens in horseshoe crabs. So if you want to skip it, go ahead and jump to the 42.5-minute mark. But for the rest of you, don't run away, because this stuff is fascinating. And this is where the research of Dr. Brockmann really shines, as she spent a good part of her career focused on the understanding of this very thing.
There's a lot of horseshoe crabs in Delaware Bay, and so there is an absolute melee of horseshoe crabs.
We covered this briefly in the previous episode, but horseshoe crab mating events are usually neither quiet nor particularly hidden from our view. When these animals decide to pass their genetics on to the next generation, well, they do it as somewhat of a group activity.
There's just thousands of them. It is quite a scene, And it will happen, by the way, either in the day or at night. It's associated with the new and full moon. So sometimes the daytime high is higher or the nighttime tide is higher. So they'll prefer the higher of the two tides. But as I say, there are a lot of horseshoe crabs there, and they will come at either time.
Kinda sounds like a fated prophecy, doesn't it? Like, oh, horseshoe crab, when the moon is at its fullest, we shall meet together on that fated beach to perform the ritual of our ancestors. Remember in the last episode when I said, in part due to their special eyes, these animals can be aware of things like the cycle of the moon, and that they can entrain a daily circadian rhythm into their brains? Well, this is one utilization of that power. From under the water, they can feel the rhythm of the lunar cycle and the dancing tides and synchronize their spawning to when tide levels are going to be at their highest. Which means that the courtship dance of these animals can begin even before they come to shore and see the tide line with their own 10 eyes.
There's a pairing that goes on out off the beach. He attaches, holds on to the very back end of the female, but he's over the female's tail. So he's kind of up on the back of the female a little bit. And the two of them come into the shore.
It almost looks like the male is hitching a ride while the female pulls him along. Typical, right? When they get to the high tide line,
the female then kind of burrows down into the sand, and when she gets down a little ways, she's usually still visible. Her back is still visible, even though she's down quite a ways. And she then lays eggs from what are called gonopores, which are right in the middle of the animal. There's a kind of hinge between the front and the back section of the horseshoe crab, and the eggs are laid right underneath that hinge. And the male is holding on to the back of her. She won't lay if there's no male on her, but as long as she's got a male attached to her, that male then spews out sperm as she's laying her eggs in the sand. So it's external fertilization. The sperm is free swimming, and then swims around. The sperm are swimming around with the eggs and the sand and the water and so forth. And the eggs are all getting fertilized as they are being laid in this kind of through this kind of cloud of sperm.
We're all marine arthropod experts here, right? So we immediately know that this in and of itself is weird. Most arthropods on land do the do internally, while some other marine arthropods do also fertilize externally. It is rarer.
It's very weird. There's nothing really else quite like it. There are some arthropods that where the female or holds on, or in the case of sea spiders, the male holds on to the eggs and they're fertilized outside the body, but they're not fertilized with free swimming sperm underneath the animal as the eggs are going down. So it's more like a frog kind of arrangement than than any arthropod that we know anything about.
And it's not just one male, one female slapping their gametes together either. Things get even wilder.
One of the really interesting things about horseshoe crabs, and it's been a big topic of our research, has been that although the basic unit is a pair, and a female won't mate unless she's got a male attached to her posterior spines, nonetheless, there are lots of males around that are not paired. And they come, so the pair trundles up on the beach, and these unattached males also come up on the beach, and they're very attracted to these spawning pairs. And they move in on the spawning pair. They sit right over in that area between the front section of the body and the back section. There's that hinge, but there's also a little hole, kind of a little area to the side where the female brings water in, and it goes back over across her gills. Well, these what we call satellite males, these unattached males, come and sit right over that incurrent canal that the females, it's just an area where there's water going in, so that she can breathe. And they sit right there. The attached male is, as I mentioned to you, he's ejaculating and putting eggs, putting sperm over the eggs, but so are the satellite males. And they are dumping sperm in underneath as well. And the eggs underneath, and the eggs that are developing are a mixture of paternity. And in fact, the satellites, depending on their exact position, the satellites are doing very well. They are fertilizing a lot of eggs. They fertilize fewer eggs, but they still fertilize eggs.
To the observer, this may all look like absolute chaos, a love fest of free-flowing genetic material with no rhyme or reason. But hey, I don't kink shame, just get your genetic goods where they need to go and let the rest sort itself out later. But is this the ultimate animal expression of free love, or is there a more calculated calculus going on underneath?
Well, this has been sort of a big question that we've been working on. And for a long time, we thought that horseshoe crabs were really just mating, whoever got in their way or something. I don't know, whoever they could grab. I don't actually think that's true anymore. I think there is certainly males are locating females along the shoreline. They seem to be responding differently to some females than others. We have less evidence of female choice in a sort of sexual selection way, but it is not just a melee. It is not completely random mating at all. There's a line between random mating and careful mate choice. I'll just say that. The males are more attracted to some females than to others. They are more likely to stay attached to some females than others. There are a number of things that we know, but part of this is just because we know little bits and pieces out of this story, and I don't have it really put together into a full picture. I just was thinking to myself, there is a sense in which females do have choice, because we know that that some females are putting out an attractant, something that attracts males, and some females do not put out this whatever this is, some kind of chemical. There are some females that are very attractive to satellites, and some females that are not so attractive to satellites. And we now have very good evidence that that's a difference in the odors that are coming from those females. And so it appears that some females choose to put out an odor that attracts males, and thus they will have multiple fathers for their offspring. And there's some females that don't put out these odors. And even on Delaware Bay, when there's just thousands of horseshoe crabs around, there are always some females around that do not attract satellites.
Who knew that deciding on the perfume you were going to put on for the day also meant how many dudes you'd have hanging around trying to get at those gonopores? Terrible jokes aside.
So in that sense, there is female choice, presumably. But we only have evidence of that in the wild. We were never able to get a captive female producing this stuff in a naturalistic kind of way.
But for now, any sort of deeper understanding of the hows, whens, and even what this attractant chemical is remains a mystery. One of the core tenets of our high school level biology courses is that of sexual selection. In a nutshell, this means that when pairs are choosing who to mate with, animals might prefer mates with traits that, if passed down to their offspring, would increase the likelihood of their kids being able to survive and thrive until it's time for them to do the next generation of the reproductive jive. In some species, the traits the mated pairs look for are obvious. Think of the showy colors and flashy designs of a peacock's tail, large antlers in deer and elk, the combat prowess in elephant seals, or, my personal favorite example, the booming, showy dance that is the lek of the greater prairie chicken. But while lots of these traits may be obvious in other animals, what, if anything, horseshoe crabs are looking for, as well as who is doing the looking and how, remains really hard to figure out. Are the males choosing females based on visual traits and whatever smells and chemicals they're putting out? Or are the females manipulating things behind the scenes with just the chemical attractant? If only the TV networks would hear out my pilot for the real house crabs of Delaware Bay. After the mating convention takes place, the parents don't exactly stick around to care for their young. Just like a coastal family vacation, it's more of a bury the kids in wet sand and hope for the best kind of strategy.
The female lays eggs in the sand, which are fertilized. And so they're laid about 4 or 5 inches in the sand. And those eggs stay down in the sand for a week or two. It's usually about 2 weeks, but it depends a bit on the temperature of the sand. The eggs are laid at the very top of the high tide. So most of this time they are out of water, but of course the sand is wet because there's water coming up from below. And so the eggs develop down there.
Jumping back a bit, this is the reason why horseshoe crabs track lunar activity and tides to ensure that their mating events take place at the highest of high tides. It ensures that for the developmental period, eggs don't get flooded but do stay moist and safe enough to become baby crabs before the next super high tide hits.
They start out as little green, little beady-like green eggs, and then the eggshell breaks and there's like a little balloon-like structure, and you sometimes see these little balloons on the beach, and that's just the embryonic membrane.
I'm going to pause for a moment to key back into that central question that we're examining of just how these animals have survived for 450 plus million years. And a clue to that lies in this egg stage right here, before life even really starts for these little guys.
In thinking about how it is that horseshoe crabs have survived over all these hundreds of millions of years, I think one of the key things that we found out in our research is that the embryos, the eggs and the embryos and the larvae are incredibly tolerant of environmental conditions. We've exposed them to all sorts of fluctuations in temperature and salinity. We've exposed them to many different kinds of pollutants in laboratory experiments. And these animals will survive in conditions that virtually any other larval marine invertebrate will not be able to make it. So these are very tough individuals. Now, obviously, we weren't dealing with pollution millions and millions of years ago, but the same mechanisms that allow them to tolerate high levels of pollution are probably important in having them survive all sorts of environmental fluctuations in the kinds of things that they would have been exposed to millions of years ago.
In a lot of animals, the younger the animal is, the more susceptible they are to death. Be that from predation, poisoning, freezing, overheating, you name it. But these little guys seem to have survival superpowers even before hatching. And that is super cool, and could help explain why these great shifts that we see in the geologic record haven't gotten the best of our wily survivor. Not only is that badass, as they develop, they are super cute, too.
And they actually swim around inside of the little balloon. They go through a couple of molts inside the embryonic membranes, and then they molt into what's called a trilobite larva. And it's called that only because it looks like a trilobite, not because they are in any way related to trilobites, but it looks a little bit like it. It's sort of horseshoe crab-like without a tail. And so they become very active and come out of their little balloons. And so after a couple of weeks, those little guys, they do this at the time when the high tide has come back into the beach. So they're laid on the new and full moon high tides, and when the water is very high on the beach, and they are activated by that. They can sense that. So when you get 2 weeks later, when you get another king tide coming up, the animals, the little guys know that there's the waters, that the beach has been inundated again. And so they get themselves out of their little balloons and come charging up to the surface. If there's a whole nest of them hatching at the same time, there's like a little volcano of trilobite larvae coming up out of the sand.
Let me repeat those words. Volcano of tiny baby horseshoe crabs. If those words alone aren't enough to get you booking a flight to the East Coast in springtime, then perhaps the video in the show notes from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service of these adorable little friends just might. Go check it out and smile. Seriously, I'll wait. I'll be here.
And they then swim off the beach. And if there's good area for settling, if it's a good nursery area right off the beach, they will settle right there, and they'll do that quite quickly. I mean, within a few days, they will settle right off the beach. If the area off the beach is not suitable as a nursery area, then they can remain as trilobites for quite a long time, and they may become a little bit planktonic, or they'll be wafted around by the currents for a while until they find a good place to settle. And when they settle, they then become juvenile horseshoe crabs, and they look exactly like horseshoe crabs, except they're, like maybe a half an inch long, wide. They're just tiny, tiny little guys, smaller than your finger. Where I've been studying them, they live right off the beach. There's a muddy area that's just off the nesting beach, and they feed on worms and little crustaceans or whatever they can find in the larval clams, I think. And they'll molt several times in that very first summer or first year. They become inactive in the wintertime. When it gets cold, they become inactive and just burrow into the mud. And so they will remain as juvenile horseshoe crabs for 9 or 10 years.
Other than the fact that they are molting and growing, that 9 to 10 year development period is another bit of horseshoe crab lore that we just don't know too much about. Here, again, we do see the crab bucking usual trends, as most marine arthropods do not take such a long time to reach reproductive age.
One of the big unknowns is what's going on in the life history of a horseshoe crab between the year that they're hatched as eggs, from eggs to embryos, and then when they come back as adults. So there's like 10 years in between with the juvenile horseshoe crabs, where the extent of our knowledge is a little bit more limited. I mean, we can find the juvenile horseshoe crabs on tidal flats during the summer, and there have been a number of studies looking at what the food preferences are for those smaller juveniles. But then when they go off into subtidal areas, we have a lot less certainty about what they're doing, either in terms of what they're eating or who might be consuming them.
But whatever they're doing out there in the shallows, it does seem to work. Part of that could be survival strategies we know nothing about, but part of it could also be a numbers game.
So let's see, you asked me how many eggs they laid. So these females now that are, these young females will lay 60, 80,000 eggs in a number of batches. Our animals in Florida are a little bit smaller, and so they produce fewer eggs. So they make batches of about 2,000 eggs, but amounts to roughly, we calculate roughly 60,000 eggs. For ours, I think the larger ones in Delaware Bay are laying more eggs. It's 80,000 or so.
Multiply that out across thousands of adults spawning all together at once, and you end up with a ridiculously high number of blue-green eggs buried in the sand like tiny pirate treasure. And those numbers are needed. Remember that they provide critical nutrition for many shore species like the red knot discussed in the previous episode. But in a perfect world, numbers like this mean that even with other animals gorging themselves silly, there are still plenty of survivors left to hatch in a sand volcano, find shelter, and begin life proper out in the salty sea. Mayhaps a morbid life strategy, but who am I to argue with 450 plus million years of success? So let's tie this back to that question that we asked in part 1 of the episode. Are horseshoe crabs living fossils? What can the life history today teach us about how, and if, these animals are evolving? And I hope you aren't overstimulated just yet, because I have more exciting news. We can see evidence of evolution happening kind of in real time, looking at populations that exist today. Just looking at the American horseshoe crab, a single species, we find distinct genetic populations that are perhaps better adapted to their local environments than a more northern or more southern counterpart.
So we worked on the genetics with Tim King and some other people. He was doing genetic analysis and found that there were DNA differences between horseshoe crabs, and he identified a series of populations. So the horseshoe crabs that are in Maine and New Hampshire are in one population. They also look a little different. They're a little bit smaller. And then there's this very large population that is south of Cape Cod that goes all along the coast in the Long Island Sound. And it goes all the way down to it's in Delaware Bay. So there's a really big sort of central population that seems to be all one population. There may be a few differences, but they're relatively minor differences until you get down to sort of North Carolina, South Carolina, but by the time you get down to South Carolina, they are really quite distinct. They are huge horseshoe crabs. Now, you can get large ones in Delaware Bay we call it kind of a Delaware Bay population, but really it's the whole mid-Atlantic states. The ones in South Carolina and Georgia and North Florida are absolutely enormous. And they also have a few other traits, little differences in the number of spines that they have on the back and a few things like that. And then all of a sudden, you get to the west coast of Florida. So there's a different population in the intercoastal waterway. And that's about 150 miles that goes all along the east coast of Florida. That is a completely different population. That one really is very distinct. And that's the area where there's no tides. It's very warm in the summertime. And it's shallow, so it also gets rather chilly, at least in the northern part in the wintertime. I'm sure it's chilly there now. And and they're very small. They're much smaller than than these giant ones that are north of them.
These differences might be really, really subtle. A different spine here, a bit smaller there, but these differences shouldn't be overlooked.
You occasionally see a mixed pair, and it is very conspicuous. This giant female with this little bitty male on the back of it. So you do get mixed pairs. They lay eggs, and the eggs develop. We collected them, so we know the eggs develop. You don't know whether they're going to be as successful as either of the parents, but at least they're developing. So these things are interbreeding, but they are maintaining genetically distinct populations, which means almost for sure that there are pretty strong selective pressures favoring whatever those traits are. We don't know, aside from size and a couple of little spines on juveniles, we really don't know what those traits are. We do know that the main horseshoe crabs are active at lower temperatures than our Florida horseshoe crabs, for example. So almost for sure there are physiological differences, there are developmental differences between these populations, but it's not really been investigated as to what these underlying genetics are showing us. We don't know what the actual traits are. We just know that there are genetic differences between them.
So, while it's not really our place yet to say if these physical and genetic differences really confer specific evolutionary advantages to these animals per se, or even what those advantages may be, we have seen that there are differences in populations.
And I think that has been a real lesson of these genetic studies that we've done, is that underneath it all, underneath this little conservative exterior, they are adapting just like everything else adapts to their environment.
That alone is pretty darn cool, showing us that as time marches forward, so do these animals, refusing to be mired in the past. So even though we don't exactly understand the rationale or the mechanism of it all, every mating event helps drive this process forward toward a new generation of animals that will be able to, hopefully, face a future with new and different conditions, different oxygen levels, different environments. Looking back into the fossil record, we see that these animals have even demonstrated the past potential of doing extreme shifts like moving into fresh water. That is not just a difference of a small little spine here or there. And this ability to adapt may be more critical now more than ever, because these animals now face a number of rather unprecedented, some might say existential, threats. And y'all, I hate to say it, but most of those existential threats are coming from a little-known species by the name of Homo sapiens.
It's kind of this sad reality that these animals that have seen the world, seen Earth change, very literally observed plate tectonics, right, are now being driven more and more to the brink of survival by humanity. And I think that's really where a conversation around the reality that we need to be engaging with these organisms. We need to be realizing that they have seen Earth change, and we now, as humans, being the greedy species that we are starting to really impact them.
Beyond the aforementioned harvesting of the crabs for bait and for the biomedical industry, these animals are also facing other human-born threats. I'm talking about things like habitat loss as coastal developments take over nesting beaches, things like climate change affecting the environments they live in, even things like microplastics ending up in the food chain and ultimately inside the crabs themselves. But before pitchforks are gathered and torches are lit, this isn't to say all human activity is bad and we've doomed a species to collapse. Quite the contrary. Examining these issues in a more nuanced fashion leads to a really interesting conversation where we see that these animals that have historically provided for us may now need our help in dealing with these threats that have arisen faster than they can naturally adapt.
Right. I mean, we know on the one hand that these animals are survivors and are tolerant of a wide range of environmental conditions. But the paradox is that human impacts, particularly those along the coastal zone, impacts related to overfishing, these are challenges that horseshoe crabs haven't faced in the past. So just because you were able to survive all the mass extinction events doesn't guarantee your survival now.
And so, as now we have reached the end of our look backward and into the present, we are going to be setting our sights squarely on the future of these animals in episode 3. I hope you join us then as we examine the human dimensions of our relationship with this animal.
Because today these are animals that are becoming more and more endangered. They're being impacted by humans. They're being influenced by factors that are not, well, they're extrinsic, or they're beyond the horseshoe crab individual, but they are ultimately human in origin. And it's kind of this sad reality that these animals that have seen the world, seen Earth change, very literally observed plate tectonics, right, are now being driven more and more to the brink of survival by humanity. And I think that's really where a conversation around the reality that we need to be engaging with these organisms. We need to be realizing that they have seen Earth change, and there needs to really be a call to arms in terms of conservation efforts for these organisms. I think we think of conservation, we think like pandas and big fluffy things, and I don't study vertebrates, so I think I'm a voice for the ugly little duckling, for the animals, exactly, the animals that really don't have a lot of support, because it's those organisms that are going extinct at a rate that is unprecedented. And horseshoe crabs, to me, they kind of really are this focal point in which people can kind of engage with. They have a distribution quite far across the globe. And so there are different cultures that have historically and today engaged with them. They also had this beautiful fossil record, an illustration of survival, an illustration of like persistence. And I think at its core, where we as a species need to be moving is actually highlighting these records of success and trying to find ways to support, conserve, and ultimately bring back these animals from getting close to that extinction space that ultimately they have managed to get through. So yeah, I think from my view, and I imagine Mark, for example, have a similar perspective. We're at a period of time in which we're starting to see these organisms facing an extinction event that they might not be able to make it through because humans are doing things so quickly and so destructively that it might be really hard for them to adapt. And so I think this really is a space in which humans need to step up and undo the work that we have done to conserve these organisms.
That's all for today's episode of Biodiversity. Thank you for listening. Another huge shout out and thank you to Dr. Jane Brockmann, Dr. Mark Botton, and Dr. Russell Bicknell for their expertise and for providing their voices to the show. Another big shout out to my biggest patrons, Vorpal Gnome and Laugh-Salodal. Your support means the world. You can become a patron too at the link in the show notes. Between now and then, I invite you to pontificate on how you might be changing from your past to your present and into your future. Because the horseshoe crabs, if they teach us anything, it's that although you might not appear to be changing or improving on the surface, true success is measured in the slow evolution of ourselves that can be just a little bit harder to see. I'll see you next time.